So, since this week marks the 51st anniversary of the Montreal Expos' first game in the venerable Jerry Park, we're going to look back at probably the biggest year in the franchise and probably the year that, in a lot of ways, destroyed the franchise because of Monday on Monday. Now, we're going to be talking about the 1981 Montreal Expos, who probably had the most talented lineup of the National League in the early 1980s. Now, 81 was the strike season, of course, and we're going to go into a little bit of the background of the split season and why Montreal made the playoffs and why the Cardinals didn't. Now, that year, with the strike shortened season, um, the teams basically were limited in regarding their offense, but Montreal had a great offense that year. Gary Carter was catching, Warren Cromartie at first, Rodney Scott at second, Larry Parrish at third, Chris Spire at shortstop, Timmy Raines, Rock Raines, Andre Dawson, and Wallach in the outfield. And they had given up on Alice Valentine early in the season because of whatever problems were having with the team. But that year as well, they had utility player Jerry White helping with the outfield core. The very young Terry Francona, a very good prospect. The veteran former Met John Milner as a utility player, and pitching. They had picked up Ray Burris in the off season, and added to Bill Gullickson, Charlie Lee, Steve Rogers, and Scott Sanderson, and pretty good rotation. Steve Rogers had these typical strong year with a 12-8 record to lead the squad, and Bill Lee was doing some spots starting and some relief. So overall, it was a mixture of veterans, experience, and young players. Um, but what happened with Montreal entering the 81 season? 1979, they finished 2 games behind the Pirates, who later went on to win the World Series. 1980, where Tim Raines doesn't play a large factor other than in some games late in the season. He lost to the Phillies for the NL East crown. Phillies went on to win the World Series. And so a lot of people were saying, they were knocking at the door the last 2 years. Montreal, I think the times is right because with Dawson and Raines especially, they were kind of an American League hitting team in the kind of National League format. And Olympic Stadium was packed that year. TV money was big. CBC was doing most of the games. CBC French was broadcasting a lot. So everything was pretty well in the factor. Now, Montreal had started the season very strong, but unfortunately, due to the player strike, which is pretty well midway through the season, you were only in third place at the strike break with a 30-25 record. So Major League Baseball made a major decision. They're saying they're going to split the schedule into two parts, where Philadelphia won the division in 1 game, 1.5 games ahead of the Cardinals were going to be the first part of the season champions. And in the second half, Montreal, they barely squeaked it out with a road win against the Mets late in the season, where Wallace Johnson had a big hit. He ended up with a 30-23 record. But ironically, the combined record, the Cardinals were the best team in the league, the National League that year, with a 59-43 record, which would gave them a combined record 2 games ahead of Montreal. Now, Montreal entered the playoffs. Cardinals were still strong. You had Pete Rose, you had Steve Carlton, and a lot of people thought that Montreal was going to struggle against the Phillies because Phillies were defending champions. They weren't too long in the tooth, and it ended up being Montreal ended up going very quickly ahead, winning 3-1 first game and 3-1 the second game. It was basically a Philadelphia comeback in games 3 and 4, with Philadelphia winning 6-2, and then Philadelphia a heartbreaker for Montreal, losing 6-5 in game 4 to Philadelphia in 10 innings. But game five, I mentioned Steve Rogers was the ace for the team, and that was star against star, and Rogers outdueled Carlton in the game, October 11, winning 3-0. And the Expos had then advanced to play the Dodgers, who had just defeated the Astros in a very exciting series to get to if I'm not mistaken, that was their fourth World Series in the last 7 years because he had lost to the Yankees twice and the A's once, and he still had their major players, Russell and Say and everybody else. But it was kind of ironic when Montreal won in Philadelphia. Warren Cromartie unveiled a great Canadian flag, and Donald Sutherland was in the crowd to see the game. So it was a very Canadiana victory for Team Canada at the time, which was the Expos, because the Blue Jays weren't that strong. Now, in the National League Championship Series, a lot of people thought the Dodgers were going to win it because of the strong pitching of the phenom at the time, Fernando Valenzuela. And in game one, it wasn't Valenzuela that drew first blood. Actually, it was the reliable Bert Hooton who held Montreal to a scattering of 9 hits, winning 5-1. Gullickson pitched an okay game, but the Dodgers with home runs from Guerrero and Solskjaer really dominated that. Now, game two in Dodger Stadium as well was a big upset because of all people that I would consider a secondary thought picking up the regular season. Ray Burrs probably pitched the game of his life, scattered 5 hits for a 3-0 win over Fernando. In the second half of the season, Fernando was having not say control problems, but he was having strike zone problems. He was throwing a lot of pitchers. He was not really that effective. Now, a lot of people were saying the next 3 games are going to be in Montreal. There's a good chance that you know, Montreal might take it. And the first game really was their advantage with Steve Rogers on the mound. He outdueled the great Jerry Royce, winning 4-1. Beginning with the sixth for Montreal, where Jerry White, that great utility player, hit a hit a home run, and there was no looking back. Now we entered Game Four and possibly Game Five, wondering if Steve Rogers would be available for Game Five, just in case Game Four didn't work out. Now Montreal had basically held the Dodgers in check for most of the game until the eighth inning, where Bert Hooten continued to dominate Gullickson, another head-to-head. Big crowd for this game, 55,000 fans. And Steve Garvey had the big hit for the Dodgers with a home run, and Montreal was held to 5 hits. And game five, another pitcher's duel. Um, Ray Burris against Valenzuela again. Burris did everything he could to hold the Dodgers off. Actually, Montreal scored first on a double play ball that scored a run in the first inning, and for then on Fernando was shutting Montreal down. The Dodgers tied the game 1-1 the fifth inning, and in probably one of the strangest managerial decisions in history, Jim Fanning decided to bring in Rogers in relief where he never pitched in relief before. And in the ninth inning, Rogers, who basically was, not a relief pitcher, Rick Monday, the great Dodger utility player, took Rogers' best pitch, and he could have hit it 500 feet, but with the cold weather in Montreal Olympic Stadium, it went over the center field fence and broke the hearts of the Montreal Expos fans from Montreal and throughout the world. Um, Now, for some strange reason, I don't know because of the weather, the attendance for this game was only 36,000. I don't know if it was just because of the cold weather or whatever. Or a lot of people felt Montreal had lost Game Four and they're probably well going to lose Game Five. Now, Bob Welch came on in relief to take the save. Now, this was the last time a Montreal Expo team or the franchise, because you moved to Washington, who won the World Series in 2019. This was the only Expo team to ever make the playoffs, and this directly led, I think, in any shape or form. They were the best team in the National League in 1981, in my opinion. They didn't underachieve, they didn't overachieve. It just seems just bad timing where you're going up against the phenom of Fernando Valenzuela, who is probably, I still call him Latino Sandy Koufax. He had four great pitches. He could dominate, the strike zone. But Andre Dawson had a bad series at the plate. Some of the players for Montreal, there was no opportunities for them, and they weren't hitting very strong. Carter didn't have a good series at the plate. Uh, they were trying to rely too much on their pitching, where Montreal Expos were a small ball. But why? Like I said, the Expos only came in 1969. They were in the pennant race in 1973. They were strong in the pennant race in 79 and 80. In 81, a lot of people said, it's bad luck, they'll be back next year. But the lack of confidence by management, the lack of confidence of Montreal, for example, he tried to sign Reggie Jackson as a free agent. And even though they had Al Oliver and some other top free agents in 82, it didn't really work out. It was just a gradual progression. You couldn't hold players or trading players. But the debacle of the late 80s, early 90s, leading up to the team being shifted, had less to do with 81 and more to do with the financial problems that Canadian franchises were having with the dollar. But I really think, in my mind, if you're going to bring anybody in relief, you could use Bill Lee. Now, because a 5 game series, you can't start 3 times in a 5 game series because you're only playing 7 or 8. They should have brought in Bill Lee. Billy, I think, had only played 1 game in the playoffs or 1 or 2 games. Billy had something, and he said in published reports many times. I don't know why he never chose me to come in because, Bill Lee could pitch in relief. He could do short innings, long innings, whatever, and he knew how to win. He knew how to do it because even though in 75 and 78, the Red Sox were defeated in 1 game playoffs and in the World Series. Billy was a part of that success. It wasn't all his fault that the Red Sox had problems. Maybe it was a lack of confidence. I don't know. But I watched all 5 games of the series. The Dodgers were just destined. Of course, as the baseball gods have declared, that was the third straight year that the Expos eventually lost to the World Series champions. I didn't see Yankees losing to the Dodgers in '81, but that's a future podcast, like the decision to take out Tommy John in Game 6, the Winfield's terrible at bats in the World Series, George Frazier, bad reliever. The Dodgers were not as good as '78, but yet the Yankees were just as good as '78, but for some reason the Dodgers bet them. That's for another podcast, the baseball gods. So on his 51st anniversary of Montreal Expos, actually tonight on TSN, they're showing El Presidente's no hitter against the Dodgers of all people, with young Larry Walker in the lineup. But there's only so many good memories of the Expos I have, and I still remember Cromartie with the flag, Sutherland in the crowd, and going to the dressing room right after. The early '80s was a recession. The Montreal Canadiens had a bad playoff run in '81. It just seems like Montreal was down, and the Alouettes were struggling as well. '81 wasn't a good sports year for the Montreal fans. But all I know is this: Cromartie, Rains, Valentine, Carter, the kid. To be an Expo fan back in the day, you could play home run ball, small ball, good pitching. Nothing better than Expo game. The games were in high def on French TV, English TV. Dave Van Horn is announcer. A lot of good times. Um, Major League Baseball didn't want to save the franchise because it was never making any more money. Now we always hope the Expo is going to come back, but that's a story for another podcast. But in my personal opinion, the Montreal Expos of 1981 were the best team in baseball. That's what I think. And the Dodgers had the best pitcher in baseball, and that was the difference. Because sometimes it comes down to 1 game, and the best team sometimes loses. That's the way it happens in any sport. Um, it's too bad because when the whole country is wearing the hat of the team, and the Expos were Canada's team for many years, even though the Expos were not as popular overall as the Blue Jays and the Canadians, but the kids loved the Expos logo. They loved the players. They used to do something called a sports exchange, that the Expos were partially funded. You would go meet the people. You used to get the Expos calendars, the Stewart Expos cards, the beautiful Montreal Expos tops and OPG cards of back in the day, the posters and the mini posters. It was a great time. And you see that ball go out though, Rick Monday of all people. Rick Money's always been a favorite because he was a person that stopped at the American flag being burned by those punks many years ago. So maybe he was destined. Maybe he went above and beyond. So you want to lose to anybody, lose to the Dodgers because Tom Lasorda pitched in Montreal for years, even though he didn't like Yuppie too much. But that's another story.